In the crisp autumn of 1979, I found myself standing at a remote outpost near the Afghan border, the air thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to hang like a heavy fog over the rugged landscape. I was a young counterintelligence officer, barely in my late 20s, thrust into a world that was about to change forever with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The date, December 24th, marked the beginning of a conflict that would define my career and haunt my dreams for years to come. Dressed in my tan uniform, the fabric coarse against my skin, I adjusted the wide-brimmed hat that shielded my eyes from the relentless sun beating down on the dusty plains. The uniform was practical, designed for the harsh terrain, with multiple pockets to carry the tools of my trade: notebooks, a small compass, and a concealed pistol. Around me stood my comrades, a tight-knit group of soldiers, each of us armed with rifles that ranged from the familiar Soviet-made AK-47s to older weathered models passed down through years of conflict. The weight of the weapon slung over my shoulder was a constant reminder of the war that had just ignited, a war that would test our resolve in ways we could scarcely imagine. The outpost itself was a modest affair, a cluster of sand-colored tents and a few makeshift barracks surrounded by barbed wire and sandbags. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the clear blue sky, a silent witness to the chaos that was unfolding. The Soviet Union had launched its invasion under the pretext of supporting the Afghan government against internal rebellion. But we all knew the truth. It was a strategic move to secure influence in the region. As a counterintelligence officer, my role was to uncover spies, gather intelligence on the Mujahideen resistance, and protect our operations from sabotage. It was a task that demanded both courage and cunning, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me as I stood there, watching the horizon for any sign of movement. My first mission came swiftly, within days of my arrival. The commanding officer, a stern man with a scar running down his left cheek, called me into his tent late one evening. The flickering light of a kerosene lamp cast shadows on the maps spread across his desk, marking villages and supply routes. He pointed to a small dot on the map, a village nestled in a valley about 10 kilometers from our position. Intelligence suggested it was a hub for Mujahideen activity, a place where insurgents gathered to plan attacks and receive supplies from foreign backers. My task was to infiltrate the village, pose as a traitor, and gather information without arousing suspicion. The stakes were high. If I was discovered, it would mean certain death, not just for me, but for the entire operation. Preparation was meticulous. I shed my military gear for a simpler outfit, a loose tunic, a turban to blend with the local population, and a satchel filled with trinkets and spices to sell. My rifle was hidden beneath a blanket in a cart I would pull, a precaution in case I needed to defend myself. The night before the mission, I studied the local dialect with a translator, memorizing key phrases and practicing the cadence of speech. My heart pounded as I rehearsed my cover story. I was a merchant from a neighboring province, displaced by the war, seeking to trade for food and shelter. The translator warned me about the villagers' sharp eyes and sharper instincts, honed by years of surviving in a land torn by conflict. The journey to the village began at dawn, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the heat that would soon rise. I pulled the cart along a winding path, the wheels creaking over the uneven ground. The mountains grew closer, their shadows stretching across the valley like the fingers of some ancient giant. Every sound, the rustle of wind through the dry grass, the distant cry of a hawk, set my nerves on edge. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the occasional shepherd or traveler I passed, though I noted their faces and the direction they were heading. Intelligence was my weapon, and every detail could be a piece of the puzzle. As I approached the village, the faint smell of wood smoke and cooking bread greeted me, a deceptive sign of normalcy. The settlement was a cluster of mud brick houses with flat roofs, surrounded by small fields where goats grazed. Children played near a well, their laughter a jarring contrast to the tension I felt. I parked my cart near the market square, a dusty open space where a handful of vendors displayed their wares. My hands trembled slightly as I unpacked my goods, arranging them with deliberate care to avoid drawing attention. A few villagers approached, curious about the newcomer. I greeted them with a smile, offering a piece of cloth as a gift, and launched into my rehearsed tale. They nodded, accepting my story with cautious hospitality, and soon I was haggling over prices, all the while listening for any hint of insurgency. The day passed in a blur of transactions and conversations. I noted the faces of the men who lingered. Too long, the women who whispered behind veils, and the young boys who carried messages between houses. One man, a wiry figure with a beard streaked with gray, seemed to watch me more closely than the others. His eyes were hard, calculating, and I felt a chill despite the midday heat. I made a mental note of him, suspecting he might be a local leader or a contact for the Mujahideen. As the sun began to set, I packed up my cart, thanking the villagers for their kindness, and promised to return in a few days. The return journey was tense, every rustle in the bushes making me grip the hidden rifle. I reached the outpost just as night fell, exhausted but alive. Back at base, I reported my findings to the commanding officer. The gray-bearded man was likely a key figure, I suggested, and the village's central location made it a potential staging ground for attacks. My report sparked a flurry of activity. Scouts were sent to confirm my observations, and plans were drawn for a surveillance operation. The officer praised my initiative, but warned me of the dangers ahead. The Mujahideen were not just fighters. They were a network supported by foreign powers like the United States and Pakistan, and their knowledge of the terrain gave them an edge. My success in the village had marked me as a valuable asset, but it also painted a target on my back. The days that followed were a whirlwind of training and briefings. I learned to read maps with greater precision, to identify the subtle signs of an ambush, and to interrogate prisoners without breaking their spirit, or my own. My comrades and I drilled relentlessly, our uniforms growing dusty and worn as we practiced maneuvers in the shadow of the mountains. The image of us standing together, rifles in hand, became a symbol of our unity, a moment captured before the war's full brutality descended. We were young, idealistic in our way, believing we could bring order to a land that had known little but strife for centuries. Yet, beneath the surface, doubts began to creep in. The villagers I had met were not monsters. They were people trying to survive, caught in a conflict they hadn't chosen. The children's laughter echoed in my mind, a reminder of the innocence we were fighting to protect or destroy. My role as a counterintelligence officer forced me to see the war through a lens of suspicion, where every smile could hide a dagger. I started keeping a journal, scribbling my thoughts late at night when the camp was quiet. It was a way to process the moral ambiguity, to hold on to some part of myself amid the chaos. One evening, a courier arrived with news that shifted our focus. A Mujahideen cell had been spotted moving supplies near the village I had infiltrated. My knowledge of the area made me the natural choice to lead a reconnaissance team. We set out under cover of darkness, moving silently through the valleys. The mission was a success. We located the supply cache and called in an airstrike, but the aftermath haunted me. The next day, I returned to the village under the guise of trade and saw the devastation. Homes reduced to rubble, families mourning. The gray-bearded man was gone, likely dead or fled, and with him, any chance of further intelligence from that source. Back at the outpost, I was commended for my work, but the praise felt hollow. The war was no longer an abstract concept. It was the faces of those I had deceived, the cries of those I had helped destroy. My superiors saw a rising star in counterintelligence, but I saw a man teetering on the edge of a moral abyss. The mountains stood unchanged, indifferent to our struggles, and I wondered how long I could carry the secrets I was beginning to uncover. The war had just begun, and already I felt the weight of the role I had been given. a role that would demand I bury my humanity beneath a mask of duty. As the weeks turned into months, the outpost became my world. The routine of missions, briefings, and sleepless nights forged a bond with my comrades. We shared stories around the fire, tales of home and hopes for the future, though we all knew the odds of returning unscathed were slim. The image of us standing together, captured in that fleeting moment of camaraderie, became a talisman against the darkness. Yet even then, I sensed the war would change us all, shaping us into something harder, something less recognizable. My journal grew thicker, filled with sketches of the landscape and fragmented thoughts about the people I met. It was my anchor, a place where I could confess the doubts I couldn't voice aloud. The call to duty had brought me to Afghanistan, but it was the land itself that began to teach me its lessons. The mountains whispered of resilience, the villages of endurance, and the war of the cost of power. As 1979 drew to a close, I stood at the outpost's edge watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. My journey as a counterintelligence officer was only beginning, and the secrets I would carry would be as heavy as the rifle on my shoulder. By 1982, the war in Afghanistan had settled into a relentless rhythm, a grinding conflict that had seeped into every corner of the land and every crevice of my mind. The photograph of my unit, 6 of us standing shoulder to shoulder in our tan, uniforms, rifles slung across our chests and grenades strapped to our belts, captures a moment of solidarity amid the growing storm. The wide-brimmed hats shaded our faces from the unrelenting sun, but they couldn't shield us from the mistrust that had begun to fester within our ranks and the villages we patrolled. As a counterintelligence officer, my days were no longer just about gathering intelligence. They had become a labyrinth of deception, where every conversation was a potential trap and every silence a clue. The Soviet campaign, launched in 1979, had morphed into a protracted struggle against the Mujahideen, a resistance fueled by foreign support and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The mountains, once a distant backdrop, now loomed as both fortress and adversary, their shadows stretching across the valleys where we fought. My role had evolved with the war's intensity. The early days of infiltration and village reconnaissance had given way to a deeper, more perilous game. I spent my nights hunched over a rickety table in the outpost's intelligence tent, decoding intercepted radio transmissions and piecing together fragments of Mujahideen plans. The crackle of static filled the air as I adjusted the dials, my eyes straining to decipher the coded messages that hinted at ambushes and supply drops. The Mujahideen were elusive, their fighters blending into the population, supported by covert aid from the United States, Pakistan, and other powers eager to bleed the Soviet Union dry. My task was to identify their operatives, disrupt their networks, and protect our own from infiltration, a mission that demanded patience, paranoia, and an ability to read the subtlest of human cues. One operation stands out as a turning point, a moment that sharpened my instincts and left a scar on my soul. It began with a tip from a local informant, a nervous man who slipped into our camp under the cover of dusk. His hands trembled as he handed over a crumpled note, its ink smudged, but legible enough to reveal the name of a double agent within our unit. The name belonged to Sergeant Ivan Petrov, a man I had trained with, shared meals with, and trusted implicitly. Ivan was a quiet soldier, his broad shoulders and steady hands a reassuring presence during our early missions. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, the air rushing out of my lungs as I stared at the informant's fearful eyes. My commanding officer ordered me to investigate discreetly, to confirm the betrayal before action was taken. The weight of that responsibility settled on me, heavier than the rifle I carried. I began my surveillance with a mix of dread and determination. Ivan's routine was predictable. He cleaned his weapon each morning, joined the others for drills, and retired to his tent with a book in the evenings. But I noticed the small things, the way his gaze lingered on the horizon a moment too long, the occasional late-night visitor who vanished before dawn. I enlisted a trusted comrade, Lieutenant Alexei, to help me monitor him, and together we set up a watch from a concealed position near his tent. The nights were cold, the wind whistling through the mountains, and our breath fogged in the air as we waited. On the third night, we saw it. A figure cloaked in a shawl, slipping into Ivan's tent with a bundle under their arm. We moved silently, capturing the stranger and dragging Ivan out into the open. The bundle contained maps and coded messages, proof of his treachery. The interrogation was grueling. Ivan's face, once familiar, twisted with defiance as he spat out his reasons: money, promises of safety for his family back in the Soviet Union, pressure from Mujahideen contacts. I pressed him for names, locations, anything to unravel the network he had joined, but his answers were sparse, his loyalty to his new masters unyielding. My hands shook as I recorded his confession, the ink blurring under my grip. The commanding officer ordered his execution, a swift and silent affair carried out at dawn. I stood watch as the shots rang out, the sound echoing off the mountains, and felt a piece of my trust shatter. Ivan's betrayal taught me to question everything, to see the flicker of fear in a man's eyes, the hesitation in his voice as signs of a hidden agenda. It was a lesson that would save my life more than once in the months to come. The war's toll extended beyond personal betrayals. The Mujahideen's tactics grew bolder, their ambushes more sophisticated. I led a team to investigate a series of attacks on our supply convoys, trekking through the arid landscape where every step could trigger a hidden explosive. The ground was littered with rocks and dry shrubs, offering perfect cover for snipers. We moved in a tight formation, rifles ready, scanning the ridges above. The attack came without warning, a burst of gunfire from the cliffs, followed by the whistle of a rocket-propelled grenade. We dove for cover, returning fire as dust and smoke filled the air. One of my men, Private Dmitri, took a bullet to the shoulder, his cries mingling with the chaos. We managed to repel the assault, but the cost was evident in the bloodstaining, the sand and the haunted look in Dmitri's eyes as we dragged him to safety. Back at the outpost, I pored over the evidence we'd recovered, a spent cartridge, a scrap of cloth, a footprint in the dust. These clues pointed to a Mujahideen cell operating out of a cave system deep in the mountains. My report led to a larger operation, a coordinated strike that destroyed the hideout and disrupted their supply lines. The success was a hollow victory. The caves, when we reached them, were filled with the bodies of fighters and civilians alike, their faces frozen in the terror of the bombardment. The war was no longer a series of battles. It was a web of shadows, where every move we made entangled us further in the suffering of the land. My work extended to interrogating captured fighters, a task that tested my resolve. The prisoners were brought in shackled, their eyes defiant, or vacant, depending on the horrors they had endured. I sat across from them in a dimly lit room, a table between us, my notebook open to record their words. The first man I questioned was a young fighter, no older than 18, his hands calloused from wielding a rifle. He spoke in broken Russian, his voice trembling as he described the village he'd left behind, razed by our airstrikes. I pressed him for information, names of commanders, locations of camps, but his answers were evasive, his loyalty to his cause unshaken. I learned to read the silences, the way his gaze darted to the corner of the room, suggesting a hidden ally. Over time, my persistence paid off, yielding details that led to the capture of a mid-level Mujahideen leader. The intelligence I gathered shaped our strategies, but it came at a personal cost. The faces of the prisoners haunted my sleep, their stories blending with the memories of Ivan's betrayal. I began to see the war through a fractured lens, our mission to stabilize Afghanistan clashing with the destruction we wrought. The mountains, with their ancient endurance, seemed to judge us, their silence a rebuke to our violence. My journal became my refuge, its pages filled with sketches of the terrain and fragmented reflections on the people I met. I wrote of the shepherd I'd seen tending his flock under gunfire, the woman who'd offered me water despite the uniform I wore. These moments of humanity were rare, but they kept me grounded amid the chaos. The outpost itself had transformed with the war's progression. The tents were patched and faded, the sandbags weathered by wind and time. Our supplies dwindled, forcing us to ration food and fuel, and the morale of the unit ebbed with each casualty. I spent my evenings with my comrades, sharing stories around a fire that struggled to warm us. We spoke of home, of the snow-covered streets of Moscow, the bustling markets of Leningrad, dreams that felt increasingly distant. The photograph of us standing together, taken during a rare moment of respite, became a symbol of that camaraderie, a snapshot of faces that would soon be marked by loss. The Mujahideen's resilience forced us to adapt. They used the terrain to their advantage, launching hit-and-run attacks that left us scrambling. I led a mission to secure a pass critical to our supply lines, a narrow corridor flanked by steep cliffs. The march was grueling, the air thin and cold as we ascended. Halfway through, we were ambushed. Gunfire erupted from above, pinning us down. I directed the team to take cover behind boulders, returning fire with calculated bursts. The battle lasted hours, the echo of shots reverberating through the pass. We emerged victorious, but the cost was steep. 2 men dead, their bodies carried back in silence. The victory report I filed was met with approval from command, but the weight of those losses lingered. My counterintelligence work grew more complex as the war dragged on. I uncovered a network of informants within the local population, men and women paid to feed us false intelligence. One woman, a widow with a child clinging to her skirt, confessed under pressure, her tears staining the dirt floor. She'd been coerced by the Mujahideen, promised safety for her family in exchange for misleading us. I arranged for her protection, a rare act of mercy that earned me distrust from some of my peers. The moral ambiguity gnawed at me, the line between duty and compassion blurring with each decision. By mid-1982, the war had become a test of endurance. The mountains, with their unyielding presence, seemed to mock our efforts, their peaks untouched by the violence below. I stood at the outpost's edge one evening, watching the sunset cast, a blood-red hue over the landscape, and felt the exhaustion settle into my bones. The photograph of my unit, taken months earlier, felt like a relic of a time when hope still flickered. The war had changed us. Our uniforms were stained, our faces lined with fatigue, our trust fractured by betrayal. Yet, we pressed on, driven by orders and the faint belief that our sacrifices might one day bring stability. The secrets I carried, names of agents, locations of caches, the faces of the betrayed, were a burden I bore alone, recorded in the pages of my journal, a silent testament to the shadows I navigated. The war was far from over, and with each passing day, I learned that survival depended not just on skill, but on the ability to live with the choices I made. By 1984, the war in Afghanistan had etched itself into my very being, a relentless tide that had worn down my body and spirit over the 5 years since the Soviet invasion began. The photograph of my unit, 6 of us standing in our tan uniforms, rifles slung over shoulders and faces set with a mix of pride and weariness, now felt like a distant memory, a snapshot of a time when we still believed in the mission. The wide-brimmed hats cast shadows over our eyes, hiding the exhaustion that had settled there, while the grenades and ammunition belts spoke of the battles we'd endured. The mountains, ever present in the background, had become both our shield and our curse, their rugged peaks a constant reminder of the land's unyielding resistance. As a counterintelligence officer, I had navigated a web of secrets and betrayals, but now, with the Soviet withdrawal looming on the horizon, my role shifted to a bittersweet task, securing our retreat while dismantling the intelligence network we had painstakingly built. The outpost, once a bustling hub of activity, had grown quiet, its tents sagging under the weight of time and neglect. The sandbags were crumbling, the barbed wire rusted, and the air carried a sense of impending departure. The command had signaled that the Soviet presence would soon draw down, a decision driven by mounting casualties, international pressure, and the Mujahideen's relentless campaign. My days were now filled with the meticulous work of erasing our tracks, destroying documents, relocating informants, and ensuring no critical intelligence fell into enemy hands. The Mujahideen's resilience had worn us down, their guerrilla tactics turning the war into a quagmire from which escape seemed the only viable option. Yet, even as we prepared to leave, the threat remained palpable, the mountains harboring fighters who would strike at the first sign of vulnerability. My final months were marked by a series of missions that tested my resolve. One evening, I was summoned to the intelligence tent, where a map lay spread across the table, its edges curling from repeated use. A scout had reported a Mujahideen cache deep in enemy territory, a stash of documents and weapons that could jeopardize our withdrawal, if discovered. The location was treacherous, a narrow valley flanked by cliffs where snipers could easily pick us off. I assembled a small team, 3 trusted soldiers, their faces familiar from years of shared hardship, and we set out under the cover of night. The air was cold, our breath visible in the moonlight, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of our boots on the rocky ground. We moved with caution, rifles at the ready, every shadow a potential threat. The journey was grueling, the valley's twists and turns forcing us to navigate in near darkness. My heart pounded as we neared the cache, the faint glow of a lantern visible ahead. We approached silently, spreading out to surround the site. The cache was guarded by a handful of fighters, their silhouettes stark against the lantern light. We struck with precision, neutralizing the guards with suppressed shots, the muffled cracks echoing faintly off the cliffs. Inside the cave, we found crates of rifles, ammunition, and a locked chest filled with papers, maps, codes, and names of collaborators. My hands trembled as I rifled through the documents, recognizing some of the names as informants we had relied on. The weight of their potential exposure pressed on me, and I ordered the team to douse the cache with fuel and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life, consuming the evidence as we retreated, the heat at our backs a stark contrast to the chill of the night. The return to base was tense, every rustle in the bushes making us grip our weapons tighter. We reached the outpost, just as dawn broke, the sky streaking with gold and pink. The commanding officer praised our success, but the victory felt hollow. The burned cache had eliminated a threat, but it also severed ties with those informants, leaving their fates uncertain. I spent the following days compiling a final report, my pen scratching across the paper as I detailed the operation and the intelligence lost. The journal I had kept since 1979 grew thicker, its pages a chronicle of the war's toll, sketches of the mountains, notes on interrogations, and reflections on the moral dilemmas that had haunted me. It was my legacy, a record I hoped might one day explain the choices I had made. As the withdrawal preparations intensified, the outpost buzzed with activity. Trucks rumbled in, loaded with supplies to be abandoned or destroyed, while soldiers packed their gear with a mixture of relief and reluctance. The faces of my comrades, once bright with the idealism of 1979, were now lined with fatigue, their eyes carrying the weight of loss. We gathered around the fire for what would be our last night together, sharing stories of battles fought and friends fallen. The photograph of us standing together, taken years earlier, was passed around, each man tracing a finger over the faces of those who hadn't made it. The laughter was subdued, tinged with the knowledge that we were leaving a land that had claimed so much from us. I spoke little, my mind drifting to the villages we had patrolled, the people we had deceived or destroyed in the name of duty. One final mission loomed before our departure. Intelligence indicated that a Mujahideen commander, a key figure in the resistance, was planning an ambush on our convoy. The location was a pass we had secured months earlier, now vulnerable as we thinned our defenses. I volunteered to lead a preemptive strike, driven by a need to protect my men and close this Chapter on my terms. We set out at dusk, moving through the familiar terrain with a sense of déjà vu. The pass was eerily quiet, the cliffs casting long shadows as we advanced. The ambush came swiftly. Gunfire erupted from above, pinning us down behind rocks. I directed the team to return fire, my voice steady despite the chaos. The battle was fierce, the air thick with smoke and the sharp tang of gunpowder. We pushed forward, flushing out the fighters, and captured the commander, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek. The interrogation was brief, but revealing. Bound and defiant, he spat out details of the planned attack, his voice hoarse with anger. I recorded his words, knowing they would ensure our safe passage, but his hatred lingered in my mind. We left him for the rear guard to handle, returning to base with the dawn. The mission's success was a small triumph, a final act of defiance against the war that had defined us. Yet, as we prepared to load the trucks, I couldn't shake the image of his scarred face, a mirror to the marks this conflict had left on me. The day of departure arrived with a somber mood. The outpost was stripped bare, its tents collapsed, and its sandbags scattered. We loaded our gear onto the convoy, the engines rumbling to life as we took our places. I stood at the rear, watching the mountains recede into the distance, their peaks a silent farewell. The journey back was long, the silence in the truck broken only by the occasional cough or murmured prayer. My journal rested in my lap, its weight a comfort as I traced the worn cover. The secrets it held, names of agents, locations of caches, the faces of the betrayed, were mine to carry, a burden I would bear long after the war ended. Upon reaching the border, we were greeted by a sparse crowd of officials and a few curious onlookers. The handover was formal, an exchange of documents and a final salute to the commanding officer. I felt a strange detachment, as if the man who had arrived in 1979 was someone else entirely. The war had shaped me into a counterintelligence officer, hardened by experience, but also a man haunted by the choices I had made. The mountains, with their ancient endurance, seemed to watch us go, indifferent to the violence we had brought and the peace we left behind. Back in the Soviet Union, the transition was jarring. The streets of Moscow buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the desolate valleys of Afghanistan. I was debriefed, my reports filed away in some dusty archive, and awarded a medal for my service, a cold piece of metal that felt inadequate against the memories I carried. My comrades dispersed, some returning to families, others to new postings, and I found myself alone with my thoughts. The photograph of my unit, now tucked into my journal, became a talisman, a reminder of the bonds forged in war. I resumed my journal, adding entries about the homecoming, the quiet nights, and the dreams where the mountains called me back. The war's echoes lingered, shaping the officer I had become. I took a post in military intelligence, where my experience in Afghanistan was both an asset and a shadow. The lessons of 1979-1984, trust tempered by suspicion, duty balanced by compassion, guided my work, but the cost remained. The faces of the villagers, the cries of the wounded, and the betrayal of Ivan haunted me, surfacing in moments of stillness. I wondered about the land we had left, the Mujahideen who had driven us out, and the future that would unfold without our presence. The war had ended for me on that dusty border in 1984, but its legacy lived on, a quiet undercurrent in the life I rebuilt. As I sit here, years later, the photograph of my unit remains a touchstone, its image faded, but its meaning enduring. The mountains of Afghanistan, with their unyielding spirit, taught me resilience, while the war taught me the fragility of human trust. The secrets I carried were heavy, but they were mine to bear, a testament to the counterintelligence officer I had been and the man I had become. The war was over, but its story, written in the pages of my journal and the lines of my face, would never truly end.